seeing countries like Venezuela, seeing countries like the Soviet Union. How can you identify with socialism when it's never worked?
Well, that's an interesting one. Let's start with Venezuela. So I think South America is incredibly unique.
Yeah.
Because of the Monroe Doctrine, because of the fact that you have this global superpower to your north.
Yeah.
The United States never let social democracy happen in South America. It was not allowed. This happens in Guatemala with a guy called Arbenz in the 1950s. He really just wants to institute a bit of land reform and trade union rights. Really nothing radical. Nothing that wasn't happening by social democratic parties in Europe. The point was that wasn't allowed. That was not allowed. So this idea of, well, if only the South Americans could have sort of mainstream centre-left politicians, and they tried it, okay? They were removed by military coups. And interestingly enough, who was in Guatemala in the 50s when that happened? Che Guevara.
Yeah.
And he says, well, they're not going to let us do that, then we've got to seize control by military means. And actually, we're going to have to hold on to power in a very different way. So I think the development of socialism in South America, it's not to make excuses for anyone, but I think the development of socialism in South America is quite unique and quite particular because parliamentary democratic socialism or social democracy like we have in Europe was not allowed. It was completely off the table. So that's parking that one. And in terms of socialism not working, I suppose, and again, I also wouldn't compare the Soviet Union to Venezuela.
Yeah.
I think Venezuela under Chavez did well because of high oil prices. So there was a sense of rising prosperity. And obviously when oil prices went down, that sort of disappeared again. I think with the Soviet Union, it was different in so much as there was a national project of industrialization too quickly. But there was a different kind of project. It was reaching towards a modernity in a different kind of way to somewhere like Venezuela, I feel. I might be wrong. And the Russian people and the peoples of the former Soviet Union, I think, can be proud of certain accomplishments, such as the first person in space. I think it's an incredible technological achievement. I think it's an amazing achievement. The defeat of Nazism. I think you should be very proud of that. And
that wasn't so much a technological achievement, but yeah.
Well, no, but you say that, but there's some really interesting stuff about this, about the ability of the Soviet Union after 1940-41 to actually start developing incredible tanks, incredible military technology. Not incredible, but it could rival the Germans. In a way that nobody predicts in the 1930s.
You know what, actually, it's the other way around, interestingly. So the Soviet Union, people don't know this because the Soviets got overrun in 41 and early 42. What actually happened is the Soviets had far superior technology in the early period, but then they got outpaced by the German military machine as the war went on. So by the end of the war, the kind of technology the Germans had is the basis of all our technology now. They had cruise missiles basically in their thousands, etc. There's a reason the Soviets lost 20 million people in World War II. But I mean, look, your point. Look, every society has positives and every way of structuring it. I guess the point that Francis is making about it not working is in the Soviet Union and in Venezuela. The argument would be about socialism that it is a way of thinking about the world that is so unnatural to human beings, the way that we evolved to think about our own interests and the interests of others. In the Soviet Union, as you know, the idea was that you were supposed to put the needs of the state above those of your own family. That it takes putting people in La Tumba, or it takes people being put into gulags to achieve that dream in which Pavlik Morozov gives up his parents to the state. Because it's such an unnatural way that doesn't really apply onto how human beings are wired. If we were mole rats or ants, where we were genetically linked, that might be easier to do. Do you see what that's kind of more the argument?
No, I think the 20th century has a series of experiments like this, from Nazi Germany to the USSR to the Khmer Rouge, where you have this incredibly, I mean, I don't even think there are economic projects, extremely cultural projects and extremely innovative as cultural projects. So like the idea that a human being is a tabula rasa, blank slate. And look, I don't think that's necessarily, doesn't have to be socialism or fascism or anything like that. I think it has a certain interpretation of human nature which we now know is wrong. We know that doesn't function. So why am I a socialist? I would actually say I'm a Marxist, frankly. And I can also go back to a few what I would call success stories regarding democratic socialism. We'll part that for a moment. I'm a socialist because I believe that workers generally should be as close to the product of their labour as possible. They should have as little of it alienated from them as possible, which means a fair deal for workers, right? So if a worker is creating value per hour of £30 an hour, I think they should be earning a significant chunk of that. Clearly, there should be a little bit of profit, there should be some taxes and so on and so forth. But the idea that a worker should be exploited from the products of their labour, I think, is a moral affront. And I think that, to me, I'm a Catholic, but that to me is almost like an article of faith. I think a good society allows workers to enjoy a significant share of the value that they create. In terms of Marxism, I'm a Marxist. The capital, Das Kapital, is not a manifesto. He does a manifesto called the Communist Manifesto, but Capital is called Capital, a critique of political economy. So what he does in Capital is he's critiquing the classical political economists, J.S. Mill, Adam Smith, Ricardo, and whatnot. And I know this is probably quite cliched for many people, and clearly that's not what happens in the 20th century, but Marx wasn't a programmatic thinker. He has some parts where he says you may need to do this, or this, or he talks about, the Civil War in France, military theory and whatnot. But the stuff that you see in the Soviet Union or with the Khmer Rouge is as connected to what Marx is talking about as, say, Nazi Germany is with Edmund Burke. That's my view. It's like saying, how could you be a conservative because of look where it ends up when you believe in flag, family,
tradition.
And tradition and patriotism and very muscular robustness. Look where it ends up. Well, there's been many decent people who believe in all those things who never ended up in that place. So I tried to have a bit more of a nuanced view. And then in terms of where it sort of succeeded, look at Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew would have identified as a democratic socialist. Look, he's very controversial figure. But Singapore and the state had a very distinct role in its development, really from the 1950s all the way through to today. Today, perhaps it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Has no natural resources. Basically, people thought it wouldn't last 10 minutes once the British left, I think, in the early 1970s. They built an incredibly complex, sophisticated, high-productivity economy. How did they do that? Central planning. They promoted people on the basis of competence and talent. And they didn't allow the free market to run riot in so much as having an unplanned economy. There was, let the invisible hand do its thing. They didn't do that. They had a significant amount of planning, and they wanted that planning to create wealth, which would lead to a more prosperous country. And it worked. Now, I'm not saying Singapore is a socialist paradise, but on things like, for instance, land. Actually, how land policy works in Singapore, it's effectively a socialist policy. So, I think it's hard to say, well, where has it worked? We've got very clear, identifiable examples of socialist policy working very well. To finish, it's interesting if you compare someone like Singapore to Venezuela. If Singapore has oil, none of that happens, right? Yeah. You do not let Lee Kuan Yew and a bunch of really intelligent, competent, remarkable young men run a country if they have a shed load of hydrocarbons. Because we have many examples where people tried to do that and they mostly got murdered. Singapore's advantage was it had no natural resources and it was in the same neighbourhood as Vietnam and China. So the US was actually quite happy to sort of say, well, look, let them do their thing. It's a bit more complicated that, and I don't want to be, I hope I'm never sort of seen as an apologist for the US.
Not at all.
But I do think there are really important lessons to learn from a whole range of societies, and I think there are positive lessons to learn from quote unquote conservative societies, and I think it's about what works.